Welcome to the how-to video for drawing Lewis structures. Again, so we're drawing Lewis structures to really show how these different compounds come together and form covalent bonds. And so anytime we depict an electron pair that's being shared, we draw it as a line, showing that it's a covalent bond between those. And so for something like H2, we really could just draw this as H bonded to H, where basically this arrow or this line shows that there's two electrons being shared. Same thing with chlorine, we could show those chlorines. We could then also draw the remaining electrons around each of those chlorine atoms. So when we draw Lewis structures, the biggest thing I can tell you is to make sure you practice a lot. But there's kind of a basic procedure, and I'm not going to read through this all now, but you can always pause the video and read through these. The way I like to think about it is when I go to draw a Lewis structure, is if we were drawing the Lewis structure for water, H2O, I go through a series of steps. First, the number of valence electrons. So I count those up. I know that each hydrogen counts as 1. There's 2 hydrogens, so we have 2 times 1, plus the oxygen valence electrons, which is 6. That gives us a total of 8 valence electrons. The next rule is to pick out the central atom. When we pick out the central atom, we're going to pick out the least electronegative atom, so the one farthest to the left and farthest down. And in this case, that would be oxygen. Hydrogen can never be the central atom, and it fulfills its octet with only 2 electrons versus everything else which fulfills with 8. So we make oxygen our central atom. We're going to connect all other atoms to that central atom, meaning that the hydrogens are going to be connected directly to that oxygen. Step 4 tells us to fulfill the octet on the outer atoms first. Well, the one thing I like to do is keep track of how many electrons I used. For every single bond I write, I subtract 2 electrons from my total. Well, we drew 2 bonds, so those are sharing 2 electrons each. So 2 electrons here and 2 electrons here. And so now we only have 4 electrons left over. So we can start putting those around the outermost atoms first. Well, hydrogen's already fulfilled its octet. It can only have 2 electrons. This counts as 2 electrons on that hydrogen. So hydrogen can no longer have any more. So the next rule says I add remaining electrons to the central atom. So I'm going to add the remaining electrons to the central atom. And now I'm going to check to see if I fulfilled the octet rule on all atoms in that structure. Each hydrogen can have a maximum of 2 electrons. It does because it has a covalent bond where it's sharing 2 electrons. Same thing with this hydrogen. For the oxygen, we can count out the valence electrons or to see if we fulfilled the octet. We have 1, 2, 3, 4. Each bond counts as 2, so that's 6. This is a total of 8 electrons. We've now drawn the correct Lewis structure for water. Sometimes we could draw multiple different types of Lewis structures, and as you go through the worksheet that I provided you, you're going to see where you start to get resonance, but then you also can draw other Lewis structures that look like they're correct. And how do we choose the best Lewis structure? The way that we do that is we actually calculate what we call the formal charge of an atom. And it's really just a charge that an atom in a molecule would have if all the atoms had the same electronegativity, and really it just helps us to determine what is the most reasonable Lewis structure. I'm going to tell you right now what most important thing on this slide, which you should circle, is this down here. And so basically what this says is that the best Lewis structure is the one where atoms bear formal charges closest to 0, and any negative formal charges are on the most negative on the most electronegative atoms. Okay? It is very important that you understand that this is probably the most important thing on this slide. Okay? Otherwise, the only other thing on here is understanding how we calculate the formal charge of an atom, which in order to do that we use this equation which just says the number of valence electrons. So for carbon would have 4 valence electrons. And we're going to subtract out all the electrons in the Lewis structure, which when we talk about the number of electrons in the Lewis structure, we're really just looking down here, where it's really all the non-bonding electrons, which are on the atom. We just count up what's around it, and then half of the bonding electrons, which are assigned. So however many bonds there are, you basically say each bond is worth 2 electrons, and we're going to take half that. Okay, that is assigned to that atom. And then we can calculate that and determine what is the best Lewis structure. So at this point, you should really go through and practice a number of different problems. Work through the worksheet and then go through the different practice problems to really understand formal charge of the atom. That concludes the How to Lewis Structure tutorial.